stumble upon Wake Forest here, and it's going to be a tough build. There's no way around that. They're coming off 2 4-8 seasons. Dave Clawson resigned back in December, and Jake Dickert, former head coach of Washington State, is there to pick up the pieces and reinvigorate this program that wasn't too long ago when they actually had some success. I mean, I go back to the 2021 season with Sam Hartman, where they were essentially runners up for the ACC championship game. So it's not like they've never been successful. It's not like they are just perennial bottom feeders. It's a difficult place to win. I mean, I'm sure Wake Forest fans tuning in right now know that, hey, they had the lowest enrollment in all of FBS football. They know how difficult it can be to recruit with the academic rigor that they have. And also, too, it's tough to replace a guy like Dave Clawson, who's pretty much the exact exemplary example of what you would want as a head coach at Wake Forest, somebody who's a program stabilizer, somebody who can recruit within the state of North Carolina, and somebody who's consistent and somebody who can maximize the players that they have. And that's what Jake Dickert is looking to do at Wake Forest going into this season, and he's going to have his work cut out for him. I mean, when you look at this team face value, they had to know that because Clawson ended up resigning, that they would definitely see a lot of roster turnover, and that's pretty evident, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Now, granted, we kind of knew going into it that Jake Dickert and offensive coordinator Rob Enzel, who's coming over from South Alabama, who was under Major Applewhite, they're going to kind of try to incorporate this spread option RPO kind of style, which I think compared to years past under Wake Forest, I think is definitely going to be something a little bit different compared to what we've seen before. But all things considered, it seems like that there are going to be some growing pains no matter how you dice this too. And when you look at them offensively, this is Jake Dickert's brainchild. You know that all of his influence is going to be under this too. And there's ever since Sam Hardman has left the Wake Forest program a couple seasons ago, there's just been so much uncertainty at the quarterback position, and now it kind of seems like you're sort of facing the same thing here. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I think obviously the guy's going to be Robby Ashford, who's a transfer from South Carolina, had some success back in 2022. And I kind of asked myself if Wake Forest can kind of tap into that athleticism that Robby Ashford has, and you pair that with a guy like Desmond Claiborne, who was 1,000-yard rusher last season, and at least in my opinion, will primarily be the vocal point of the offense this season, it could be an intriguing combination. It's not like Robby Ashford's never been successful. I mean, granted, a lot of his success was mainly back in 2022, and there's definitely something to tap into, right? Because I think Robby Ashford's kind of itching to finally be out on the football field after being a backup at the last couple spots that he has, too. And granted, it's also worth mentioning that they have Deshaun Purdy, who's a transfer from Charlotte, somebody that I think they're going to probably plan on redshirting this year, and somebody they can probably develop behind him, too, because he has a very similar skill set to Ashford. And I think all things considered, is Ashford the type of guy that I am necessarily excited and super hyped about? No, not necessarily, but I think you have a guy who's certainly going to be a solid quarterback, somebody who I think you can tap into that athleticism, and I think somebody who's really a perfect fit for what Wake Forest is trying to do when it comes to, hey, they really just need a guy who at least has some experience, can kind of ride the ship, and at least can try their best to kind of maximize what they have too. And granted, this doesn't come without question marks, right? I'm really concerned about the wide receiver room here. I mean, the majority of the guys that they have are going to be brand new transfers. Majority of them don't even have 100 receptions yet. So there's definitely going to be some growing pains in terms of implementing the new style, really trying to figure out how do you maximize Claiborne in this as much as you can too. And also just the wide receiver room with really just a bunch of young guys too. I mean, Micah Mays is going to be the guy who, at least in terms of returning production, is going to be kind of your number one guy. And he's a redshirt sophomore. So, I mean, you really can't set the bar that high for a guy like that too. And, it just goes to show, I mean, you see this particularly whether it's in terms of the talent that they brought in, but you can also look at them in terms of how they've recruited and how they've fared in the ACC in the past couple seasons. In both those 4-8 seasons that Wake Forest has had, they went 1-7 last in 2023 and 2-6 in 2024 in terms of ACC play. So it's pretty evident that, yeah, they definitely have had their struggles. And I think that's probably why you can argue why Dave Clawson was probably at least burnt out to some degree. Now he's never going to sit there and say, hey, Wake Forest didn't give me enough resources. They didn't do X, Y, and Z. That's why I resigned. But on the outside looking in, you can understand why Dave Clawson probably said to himself, hey, this game is just simply not what it was when I started. And I think a lot of the time too, Wake Forest isn't going to be that type of team that's going to have the huge NIL fund. They're not going to be the type of school that they're going to be sitting there like Texas Tech and bidding on players for millions of dollars. They want players who are there for the academics. They're going to want a guy that understands the small school feel of it, and kind of building that culture and that program from there too. And I mean, I think you even see this in terms of the recruiting that they've gone to in this season. Pretty consistently in terms of Wake Forest, they've always kind of been ranked somewhere in the 60s, aside from 2024 when they were ranked 51st in their last season with Dave Clawson. Once again, this is going to be the lowest ranked class in all the ACC, so you can't necessarily be too surprised about that too. I mean, I think what really spells concern in terms of this transfer class, I mean, granted, it's great that they've brought in a number of transfers. They have 33 transfers, 22 commits. Majority of them are primarily 2- and 3-star guys who are out of state. But 17% of these kids are in state too, which I think is definitely a little bit concerning, considering that, the Carolinas, that should be their pipeline. That should be their hotbed. And I think that's something that they're definitely going to have to target moving forward if they want to have sustained success. Because when I was looking at this Jake Dickert hire, one of my big question marks for Jake Dickert was, can he recruit within the state of North Carolina? And I think if you're judging that based on what I'm seeing from this class right now, I think there's going to be some more difficulties here. I mean, the closest he's ever recruited from the state of North Carolina is when he was assistant at like Southeast Missouri State or some shit like that. So it just goes to show that I think that's going to continue to be a problem. And even when you look at the rest of the staff that he brought in, I mean, Scotty Hazelton as his defensive coordinator, who, had a 3-year stint at Michigan State. And then you also have Rob Enzel, who's, South Alabama as well. So, I mean, that's really not that close in terms of a recruiting pipeline. So at least if you're a Wake Forest fan, that's something that I'm really deeply concerned about. I think they're obviously going to bring in the offensive blend that they want. I think that Desmond Claiborne is going to continue to be the vocal point, and I would not be surprised if he has another 1,000-yard season. But, how do they maximize Robby Ashford? Because I think that he's a kid that's definitely excited and definitely somebody who's going to be ready to kind of take that next step and really kind of put a whole season together and kind of show a lot of these SEC schools, the Auburns of the world, the South Carolinas of the world, that, hey, you shouldn't have kept passing up on me, and I'm going to make you pay for that, and I'm going to try to bring some noise to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, at a program that I think desperately needs some energy. Because I think when you kind of look at this team on paper, I think it's a team that's been stale, a team that hasn't been energized in quite a long time. And I think that's really kind of why they went for a young up-and-coming guy like Jake Dickert, who I think they're kind of hoping can kind of really spark an immediate turnaround too. And now, granted, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but they do have a couple things going for them, right? I think the schedule that they have going into 2025, I'd be pretty freaking stoked if I were them. I mean, you miss pretty much all the big hitters of the ACC. You don't have to play Miami. You don't have to play Clemson. You don't have to play Pitt. You don't have to play Syracuse. You don't have to play Boston College. A lot of these tougher teams that are typically going to be on their schedule. Because when I look at the schedule, obviously Kennesaw State and Western Carolina are going to be kind of your laughers of the year. They do play Oregon State, who they're obviously pretty familiar with, on the road. That's going to be later into the season. But to me, really the toughest game that I see on here is going to be that November 1st road game versus Florida State. And we don't really know what we're going to see from Florida State by then. I think we're going to kind of see how much of that crap talking that Thomas Castellanos did, how much of that really ends up being all talk versus kind of all action. So we'll kind of see what happens there. But I mean, there's a realistic chance that if they can kind of turn some heads and, end up taking an upset win versus North Carolina State, who I think is going to be another kind of wild card team in terms of the ACC, with Dave Doran over there going into his 8th, 9th, 10th year at this point. And you also have an idle date in between that Georgia Tech game as well, who I think is going to be another team that I wouldn't be surprised if they end up ranked top 15, top 20 by the end of the season, given what they have. So, I mean, yes, granted, they do have to play some teams that I think are probably better than them. I mean, obviously having to play in Blacksburg is never ideal. A road trip versus Oregon State in the middle of the year is never ideal. You have to go for SMU. So that tougher middle half, I think, is going to be difficult. However, there's a real chance here that they can get the six wins this year. Now, the over and under has been about 4.5, and probably rightfully so if you consider that your wins are going to be Kennesaw State, Western Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. If those end up being your 4 wins right there, then maybe they get an upset win against an Oregon State, a team that Jake Dickert knows really well, or maybe they knock off a Duke or Virginia towards the end of the year to kind of give them that 5 wins. So if you're Wake Forest, I'd probably sit there and say to myself, you'd probably be okay with another 4-8 season, even though on paper that's obviously not what we want. But I think you're probably okay with that, with another 4-8 season there. And then to briefly touch on the defense real quick, it was a shit show last year on defense, right? I mean, we knew that there'd be plenty of faces coming in. We knew that they would be relying primarily on transfers for a lot of FCS programs, particularly kids who were kind of focused in on the Midwest, for example. The defensive line in particular, they kind of really honed in on. They have Gabe Kershik coming in from Colorado State. You have Dallas Afaleka from Idaho, and you also Jaden Loving from Western Kentucky. I think are going to be 3 guys that we're going to be talking about towards the middle of the season as well. But, when you give up almost 33 points a game and you give up over 430 yards of overall offense a game, I mean, it's just unsustainable where they're at. But you think about all the guys that they brought in, and it's just not that exciting. You don't sit there and say that a lot of these guys are going to be real difference makers too, especially when you look at the cornerback room, and they're essentially doing the same thing they did last year, trying to plug in a couple different cornerbacks who came in from smaller schools and kind of hope for the best. Now, granted, when you have, the Ladarius Webb Jr.'s coming in from South Alabama, you have Karan Purdy from North Carolina A&T, who I think both could be solid, but not exactly spectacular. But what I would be excited about if you're Wake Forest defensively is you have Nick Andersen coming back. You have Dylan Hazen, and you have Davaughn Patterson, 3 of their top 4 tacklers coming back too. So at least there's going to be some leadership in terms of that locker room. And at least you have some guys that you can kind of at least put in your trust and put in your stability towards the beginning of the season, as Scotty Hazelton really puts his spin on the defense, and as they really kind of try to figure out what they have and what they don't have. But if you're a Wake Forest fan, I definitely think you have some serious concerns outside of Robby, Ashford, Desmond Claiborne, and the overall soft schedule that I would argue that Wake Forest has.